So it just wouldn't feel right now that our introductions are out of the way. Uh, if I didn't use, say, the first real episode, I guess, uh, to talk about Gaza, I think this is definitely going to piss off a lot of people and alienate a lot of my potential fan base. But honestly, I think that if you're unwilling to have a conversation about this, then it's probably for the best that you be alienated from the discussion that I'm trying to start here. I'm looking for people who are intellectually honest, who are willing to admit they might be wrong, um, just like I am willing to admit that I might be wrong. We need to both admit that before we can really have a serious discussion of any kind. Um, so, I guess I should start, though, to really elaborate with morality and just my perspective on how the world works at a fundamental level. Um, I think probably the most problematic aspect of modern day society is the lack of formal education by the state on logic when children are young. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I'm not saying that people are stupid. Uh, Rather, quite the opposite. I'm saying that there has been, at least in my perspective, a seemingly deliberate attempt to excise critical thinking and logic from the curriculums in schools. And I see this very prominently as a mathematics tutor. That's what I do. I moonlight as a mathematics tutor. And these kids don't know logic. They're very smart. They're able to understand what I'm talking about, but they do not understand the fundamental groundwork of what they're doing. They've never been educated on logic. And you can see this most clearly in geometry when they're asked to do proofs. They just have no concept of what they're being asked anymore. Um, I often have to educate them on like the fundamental basics, like Aristotle, what logic is kind of stuff before we can really even begin to discuss proofs because they've never heard it before. Um, so this to me, I view as a massive, massive problem for the advancement of the human race. In particular, uh, we really need to be focusing on the ability to critically think. That is to say, the ability to discern what is true when presented with conflicting evidence. Um, this is different than just relying on your gut. Um, it's going with the best explanation you have available, despite what your gut tells you. That is often the situation with logic is your gut will say do this, but when you think through the situation, you realize a different action is the better choice. That is an example of how we use logic in our day-to-day lives. Um, so I guess you might be wondering why this rant about logic. I said I was going to talk about Gaza. Well, this to me, I think, is of critical importance when it comes to this discussion. Because there is a lot of, there's a word here you might know, conflation. People will say that two words mean exactly the same thing, but in reality, those two words have some sort of nuanced difference, or phrases perhaps might have some sort of nuanced difference in their meaning. Let me think. A good example of this could be, for example, from the river to the sea. To some people, that phrase resonates as like sounding very hateful. And it's not on me to discount their experience. However, to most of the people that I know which use that phrase, um, they don't mean it as a call to violence. They mean it as a call to action, sure, but not violence specifically. And in particular, many of them are anti-violence. They don't mean this in a violent sense. Um, so to claim, even regardless of how it makes you feel, even if it makes you feel bad, which is valid and real, but even if it makes you feel bad, that doesn't make them incorrect in what they're saying. We still have to, again, use logic, use critical thinking to evaluate what it is that they're actually saying and come to a conclusion based on reason, not rhetoric. And they're not saying that when they say from the river to the sea. They're just not talking about murdering a bunch of Jewish people. That is not what they mean, even if that is what you feel when you hear that. There's that old adage. I try not to use it, but I'll at least drop it here. Facts don't care about your feelings. The fact is that's not what they mean. Everyone understands why you might interpret it that way, but that's just not what they mean. And you have to be realistic about these things at a certain point. Like, you're just acting like a delusional person. Like, it's just very strange when you know it was a misunderstanding, when the miscommunication has been resolved, and you still remain angry. That's confusing to most people. But I digress. So yes, this is a very common problem. This conflation that happens oh so often is an immense problem. Most notably, I think, the biggest conflation that I see is with regards to the word anti-Semitism. I see people saying that to be against, say, the behavior of the government of Israel, or even to be against the existence of Israel, to claim that this is inherently anti-Semitic. And while some of those people claiming that, or some of those people saying these things or wanting these things, they might be anti-Semites, it's not intellectually honest, it's not actually true to label all of those people as being just hateful towards Jewish people in their heart. That's not actually a logical conclusion to come to. There's a fallacy here called jumping to conclusions that's going on. And it's because of this conflation. And again, the way they feel, these people who say, you saying this makes me feel this bad way, we have to be understanding of that. You have to have compassion for people who have trauma, especially generational trauma. But at the same time, to use your trauma to control others and demand that other people conform their behavior to your trauma, that's very often not healthy. There can be times where it's needed, especially in one-on-one relationships. But when you're talking about everyone, come on. That's not a healthy relationship with reality at that point. So yeah, I would say there's a huge difference between anti-Semitism, which to me, when I hear anti-Semitism, what I think of is essentially racism, but against people who are of Jewish descent. That's what, to me, I hear. So an inherent thinking that people who are Jewish are lesser, that would be anti-Semitic, for example. And, that's horrifying. These ideas of anyone being lesser, to me, I strongly say that's disgusting rhetoric. There is no such thing as a human being that is lesser than you. But at the same time, you're not superior to any other human being. At least that's the way I see it. I'm very strongly against any kind of supremacy, whether that be white supremacy or any other kind of supremacy, Christian supremacy, Islamic supremacy, any of that, I will happily denounce, because that is simply unethical. And at least in my worldview, there's no ethical way to go about creating a society that is actually equitable doing that. Um, you have to set aside this desire to be supreme and treat everyone as if they are equals. Even if you want to hold to your personal belief or whatever, you still have to treat people like they're your equals. Like this is the social contract in a nutshell. But I'm getting off track. ADHD is a hell of a drug, as they say. So anti-Semitism versus anti-Israel sentiment. These are completely distinct. Like when I criticize, say, the Israeli government, I might even criticize the Israeli society, the Israeli populace, Israeli people in general. That even if I did that, which to a limited extent I might, even so, that isn't inherently against people who are Jewish or people who are of the religion Judaism. That those two categories are different, and that's where I talk about conflation when it comes to logic. These are two completely separate categories, and oftentimes folks will insist that they are the same category. But I fundamentally reject that. I think that is obviously fallacious. There's no clear, like the Venn diagrams overlap, but it's not a circle. If you understand what I mean by that, you'll see what my point here. It's very much, though, a critique of, I guess, rather, a criticism of any government is very much not a critique of the most prominent ethnic group that government presides over. Does that make that clear? I hope it does. Let me run that back. No matter what ethnic group is the predominant ethnic group in under a particular government, criticizing that government is not the same thing as criticizing that ethnic group. Even if that government is something like South Africa or Israel, where that government identifies themselves strongly with that ethnic group, it still isn't a criticism of that ethnic group. Ultimately, this is just the way that words work. This is how logic and reason dictates that we must interpret what is being said, if we are to be honest actors. And, something you'll learn about me, you'll hear me talk about this a lot, is this intellectual honesty, the importance of this. Actually admitting when you might be wrong and trying to come to the best conclusion available, not based on feelings, but based on logical corollaries. And so let's see where to go from here. I don't script this out at all. With that in mind, I have strong criticisms of the Israeli government. I also have strong criticisms of the Israeli culture in general. However, I find Judaism to be fascinating. I am a scholar of religion. I love to study it. Judaism is really interesting. I've been learning about Kabbalah recently. I think it's really neat. I have a lot of respect for any religious construct for the most part. Although I don't personally abide by one, I just think that they're interesting. And we can perhaps have an episode about what exactly my spiritual beliefs are. They're quite complex. But suffice it to say that I am not fundamentally anti-Judaism or anything like that. But I do have strong criticisms of the culture that the Israeli society has cultivated. If you look at surveys of their society, vast swaths of people in Israel are for what I would very pointedly call a genocide. They're widely in favor of it. It's a popular thing in Israel. And I do think that's a valid criticism, and this is a great example of what I'm talking about. That this group of people who are predominantly of a particular ethnic group, I have strong critiques of them, but not because of their ethnicity, because of their morality and their behavior. This is what I criticize. And to claim that I am hiding some other secret belief is simply intellectual dishonesty. You're not being real at that point. I think even you must know that you're behaving dishonestly when you claim that I'm hiding some hidden belief about hating Jewish people. Like, either that or I must feel sorry for you. Like, I would pity the level of fear that you exist under and, offer to give you a hug. Like, I don't really know what else I could do at that point, but just like give you a hug and tell you it's all going to be okay and that I don't hate you and hope you believe me. And I guess, yeah, this is a sad thing about our society, is that being in disagreement about certain things, immediately people jump to, well, you must hate me, or you must hate this thing, like, or this group. And like, no, that's different. Disagreement and hate are two different words. They're different words for a reason, because they have different meanings. And this is, again, why we say anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. They're different words for a reason. They are slightly different. They have a nuanced difference. And if we're to be intellectually honest actors, we must admit that. That is simply the reality of the situation, and there's nothing emotional attached to that observation. It is simply just looking around and the conclusion that one must come to if they're honest with themselves. I need a sip of water. So, the genocide in Gaza is bad. That's a big part of what I'm saying. It did not start on October 8th. It was not because of October 7th. The genocide in Palestine started before World War II. It is actually not about Israel at all. It has nothing to do with Israel. It actually has a lot more to do with Great Britain than it does with Israel. Israel just represents a continuation of a process that Great Britain started. And like, as much as I am against ethno-states, if people really, really want to have an ethno-state, as long as they're not being violent, like, I guess let them have an ethno-state, it's, I guess. But they picked the wrong location. Like, and I guess I should explain what I mean. There was like a huge discussion after World War II of where to put Israel. And there were a lot of locations which were discussed. And the current location of Israel was the least popular choice. It was ardently spoken out against as the choice location for Israel, and like was chosen anyway, despite protestation, because of religious beliefs. And again, as much respect as I have for religion, we have to be willing to admit that we might be wrong. We have to treat other people in such a way that conveys that we know that. And so to look at your religion and say, I believe this thing, therefore you have to behave as though it is true, this is illogical. This is not reasonable. We can't actually behave that way and expect an equitable society to emerge. It's just not how things work. We have to actually be respectful of each other. And so to say my religion says I get this land, which is essentially what happened, that's just not reasonable. And again, this was a continuation of a process started really even before Great Britain. If I remember correctly, it was the Turks that violently ousted the previous landholders, who had violently ousted the landholders before them and before them and before them, on and on and on and on and on, all the way back until biblical times. That area has been quite tumultuous. Or since biblical times, I should say. That area has been quite tumultuous. And the one constant about that area is that the people living there never had a say in anything that was going down. It was always the people with the biggest sword, with the biggest army. Those were the ones who were making the decisions about what happened to the people who lived there, never the people who lived there themselves. In contrast, many of the other locations that were presented as possible locations for Israel had virtually no indigenous population whatsoever. Several of them were also sacred to the Abrahamic religions and were proffered up and had much more favor among the international community as locations for essentially the Jewish population of the world to be rehabilitated after so many people were lost in the Holocaust, which is such a tragedy. And I can understand, as much as I don't think the argument is very good, I can understand why people would want to do that and, would say the ends justify the means and all of these things. But in that specific location is like the worst possible place that they could have chosen. And they strong-armed their way. That is, the British government, for the most part, strong-armed their way into making this be the location where Israel would be, knowing that it would be a massive problem. And it has been a massive problem ever since. So again, I think this is just observing the reality of the situation. I would be being dishonest if I said anything else, frankly. And if you disagree, I would love to hear you say why you think that's not the case, why the British government was justified in behaving this way. But I still haven't heard a compelling argument as to why this type of behavior is reasonable other than white people good. And like, that's just racism. So excuse me if I strongly disagree with you. Like, that is just how I think. So yeah, where to even go from here? I said so before, there's no such thing as a lesser human than you. Just deal with it. You're not superior to anybody. If you have more wealth, that does not make you superior. If you have more love in your life, that does not make you superior. And likewise, there's no such thing as an inferior person. If someone has less wealth than you, if someone looks different than you, if someone speaks a different language than you, or lives in a place that you think your God told you you got to live in, they're still not lesser than you. That's a completely absurd thing to insist that they are. And flatly is racism against any, if it's against, say, a racial ethnic group, then that's racism, or it could be a variety of other isms, I suppose. But it's generally these types of isms that we want to avoid. It's not an equitable, ethical way to behave, to think this way and to operate this way as though you're right because of your religious belief. So with that in mind, I say free Palestine. If you were to ask me, do I support a two-state or a one-state solution, I would honestly say that you're asking the wrong person, that you should really be asking the Palestinian people what they want. Some of them want a two-state solution. Many of them want a one-state solution. I think that's the more, if I'm understanding the culture correctly, then one-state solution is the more dominant perspective. And honestly, I think people make that out as like a really hard thing to do, but the population in Israel is really quite low. The cities there are very small. The buildings are not very tall. It would not be hard to share the land in an equitable way. The reason the Israeli government is so strongly against that is because then they would no longer have an ethno-state. But I believe that the Jewish population on the planet can be rehabilitated without an ethno-state. In fact, it is already being rehabilitated in many nations around the world which are not ethno-states. So I fundamentally disagree with the premise that it is even necessary to form an ethno-state. And so for that reason, I think a one-state solution is the best option, and that we could just make, say, a few of the jewels of Israel, we could make those cities a little bigger, make the buildings in them a little taller. Hell, let's make them super nice. Luxury condo complexes. For any Israeli that moves off of land that used to be a Palestinian person's land. We give them a permanent free house in Tel Aviv or something like that. We could do it in a way that isn't mass displacement, that isn't genocide, and just share the land if you're okay with not having an ethno-state. But if you insist on having an ethno-state, that's the only argument that I have heard that effectively is like a counter-narrative against what I'm suggesting here. If you have some other argument that isn't just fascism, I would love to hear it. Feel free to comment it. I'd be very interested to know. But to me, the conclusion that seems the best based off of available evidence is just stop fighting and share the land, and then make some beautiful buildings and house Israelis there, and then make a democratic government. Like, there's a bunch of places in the world where Jewish people are safe right now. Like, there's a massive Jewish population in America, and many other nations around the world, Canada, too. So, and yes, anti-Semitism is on the rise. Genuine anti-Semitism is on the rise, especially if you look at the American right. But there's also so many people, so many more people. Despite how many racists there are now, there's so many more people who are not that, and who would, be right there on the battle lines with you. If they started doing like a Jewish genocide again, I would be pissed about that. I would be vocal about that. I would be trying to stop that. I'd be down there trying to make things happen. I guess my body doesn't work like it used to, so I can't promise I'd fight, but I would network and, do computer stuff. I'm really good at computer stuff. I would be trying my best to stop that. The same way that I do my best to stop anything. But in this wacky system we have, I have essentially no power to actually do anything without a platform, which is part of why I start this, is to hopefully, exercise this small platform I've built of like 800 followers. Maybe I can communicate something to them, and then they can communicate this to their peers, and so on and so forth. There's only a few degrees of separation before everybody has heard about this idea of intellectual honesty, and like maybe we could pique people's interest in having like open and honest discussion again. I really think that is something that we've lost over the years. And we think like people like Joe Rogan and Ben Shapiro, offer this honest, open discussion, but they're not being honest and open. They're so strongly biased. And it's to anyone who doesn't share their bias, it's plainly obvious that they are biased. So yeah, I guess that's what I'll leave you with today, is this idea of like, be honest with yourself and others, that you don't know everything, and that neither do they, that you aren't better than them, and that they aren't better than you. And I think if you do this, it will change your life for the better. Broken relationships will mend. New friends will be made. Minds will be changed. All of those things. So please join me in intellectual honesty. I can tell you from experience, it's a better place to be. It's something that I think a lot of people have forgotten is even an option. Maybe they were never told. But yeah. And with that, I love you. Survival is resistance. And I'll see you next time.